It's a pleasure to welcome you this afternoon to a book discussion and article discussion with one of the most interesting writers and observers on foreign policy today, George Packer. My name is Matt Spence. I'm a co-founder and board member of the Truman National Security Project, and we're delighted to host this conversation over Zoom. I'm going to introduce George and then tell you a little bit about the Truman Project, and then introduce Jenna Ben-Yehuda, the CEO of the Truman Project, who's going to be moderating today's discussion. George Packer is a staff writer at The Atlantic and the author of one of my favorite books, The Unwinding, An Inner History of the New America, which was a New York Times bestseller and a winner of the 2013 National Book Award. He's also written Assassin's Gate, America in Iraq, which was a finalist for the 2006 Pulitzer Prize. He's the author of 2 novels, a play, and a 2-volume edition of edited essays by George Orwell, enough to make us all wondering, what are we doing besides thinking about foreign policy? What brings us today is George is the author of a recent biography about Richard Holbrooke called Our Man, Richard Holbrooke and The End of the American Century, which has just been published in paperback. It won the 2020 Los Angeles Times Book Award and was a finalist for the 2020 Pulitzer Prize. Jen and George will talk more about the book, but as someone who spent time with Richard Holbrooke and was interviewed by George for the book, I was struck it's really not just a story of Richard Holbrooke, but really the evolution of American statecraft right now. George is also the author of a recent Atlantic article, which was received a lot of attention, Whether America is a Failed State, prompting our conversation, and really shows how much George thinks ahead about some of the bigger issues focusing on today. George's relationship with the Truman Project actually goes back to a shared family tree history that you may not have been aware of. Les Gelb, who recently passed away as the former New York Times foreign affairs columnist and former president of the Council on Foreign Relations, was the first board member of the Truman Project when Truman was founded and first connected us to George. And what the vision that the Truman Project had from the beginning, shared by, I think, Les, that we all think about is, the Truman Project is an organization dedicated to training, recruiting, and helping to drive forward the next generation of American foreign policy leaders. It's grounded on a set of principles that America can reflect both strength and power in the world, but also a set of values that are grounded in things that go beyond winning elections and go beyond a specific party. And right now, the Truman's mission to recruit a group of fellows from around the world, help them be energized and do great things, is really more important than ever. We have a number of Truman Fellows in this conversation, which we're grateful to have. And I know a number of others who may be new to the Truman Project, and we're delighted to have you here, and thanks for joining. Before I turn over, I just want to introduce Jenna Ben-Yehuda. Jenna is the CEO and president of the Truman Project and the Truman Center. We're fortunate to have her distinguished career at the State Department, in the private sector, teaching in academia. Her awards and accolades are too long to list right here, so I'll just get into the heat of it with Jenna. But Jenna, thanks for your leadership in this time. Thanks for hosting this conversation. George, thanks for joining us. And over to you, Jenna and George.
Thank you, Matt.
Great. Thank you so much, Matt, for that generous introduction and for your leadership. And it's great to have the connectivity across the generations of Truman and see how far we've come and how much the world has changed, and maybe in some ways how little it has changed. George, welcome to our virtual fireside chat here. You can hear the crackling of our Zoom fire.
Oh my God.
We're really delighted to have you here today. Thanks for joining us.
I'm really pleased because I've been a long admirer of Matt Spence of the Truman Project, of what you do. So it's great to be with you. I wish it were in person, but that's not the world we're in right now.
Indeed, for so many reasons. Well, you have written a tremendous biography of Richard Holbrooke, which is, as Matt notes, so much more than that. I'd like for us to start with the book, and if we can just jump right in to ask you to kick us off with a flavor for the book and read a little bit for us so we can get in the mood here and settle into our conversation.
All right, well, here it is, out in paperback 2 days ago. You can get your copy online. There's a a link called bookshop.org that allows you to support independent bookstores through a consortium. So if you buy it from them, you're supporting your local independent bookstore. So this is from the prologue to Our Man. I'm going to read the first paragraph of the prologue and the last paragraph. Holbrook, yes, I knew him. I can't get his voice out of my head. I still hear it saying, "You haven't read that book? You really need to read it." Saying, "I feel, and I hope this doesn't sound too self-satisfied, that in a very difficult situation where nobody has the answer, I at least know what the overall questions and moving parts are." Saying, "Gotta go, Hillary's on the line." That voice, calm, nasal, a trace of older New York, a sing-song cadence when he was being playful, but always doing something to you, cajoling, flattering, bullying, seducing, needling, analyzing, one-upping you, applying continuous pressure like a strong underwater current, so that by the end of a conversation, even 2 minutes on the phone, you found yourself far out from where you'd started, unsure how you got there, and mysteriously exhausted. And this is the end of the prologue. What's called the American century was really just a little more than half a century, and that was the span of Holbrook's life. It began with the Second World War and the creative bursts that followed: the United Nations, the Atlantic Alliance, containment, the free world. And it went through dizzying lows and highs until it expired the day before yesterday. The thing that brings on doom to great powers and great men, is it simple hubris or decadence and squander, a kind of inattention, loss of faith, or just the passage of years? At some point that thing set in. And so we are talking about an age gone by. It wasn't a golden age. There was plenty of folly and wrong, but I already miss it. The best about us was inseparable from the worst. Our feeling that we could do anything gave us the Marshall Plan and Vietnam, the peace at Dayton, and the endless Afghan war. Our confidence and energy, our reach and grasp, our excess and blindness, they were not so different from Holbrook's. He was our man. That's the reason to tell you this story. That's why I can't get his voice out of my head. So that's the beginning of the book, and it goes on to tell the story.
Well, thank you for that, George. And I think for those of us, myself included, who spent any time in the halls of the Department of State, I think the ghost of Holbrook, for good and for ill, still is very much a part of the feeling of the building, which Hillary Clinton, as secretary, attributed real life kind of human attributes to. She talked about it as a living and breathing organism. And I think Ambassador Holbrooke is certainly a part of those vibrations in really complicated ways. You know, I think your article about your diagnosis of the United States as a failed state spread in our circles like wildfire. It was kind of at one and the same time a clarion call, an obituary, a warning, all of these things together. And I wonder if we could, I know we'll get into a broader discussion of where we are as a nation, but I'd like to start with a continued conversation about the book and why, of the numerous statesmen that we have in our history, past and present, why it was Richard Holbrooke through which you sought to build this broader metaphor of the end of the American century.
So why did I write this book? Partly because I happened to be offered his papers by his widow, Cathy Martin, just a few weeks after he died at the end of 2010. And I knew that I had to either say yes or I would lose them and someone else would get them. And the papers turned out to be an incredibly rich and revealing trove of diaries and letters and notes he wrote on hotel stationery or scraps that he slipped to colleagues at the Situation Room table. Not systematic, but incredibly revealing both of his life in diplomacy and of the way government works. So the archive made it irresistible, but the other thing that made it irresistible was Holbrooke himself, who was larger than life is the cliche. It doesn't really begin to do him justice, because everyone who brushed up against him felt something, whether it was a bruise or a vibration of idealism or of excitement about getting involved in public service, or a kind of detestation of his ego and his character, or humor. He just filled his life, every minute of it, with so much experience. And the other reason he seemed like a good subject is not because of his CV. It's not a monument. It doesn't record a bunch of accomplishments. It's not that kind of book. His accomplishments were many, but they were not the Marshall Plan or the opening to China. He wasn't a statesman on that level, although he dearly wanted to be. In some ways, it was his own failings that kept him, and in some ways, it was the time in which he lived. It didn't maybe make room for someone like that in the way that his heroes of the past had had room. So it wasn't so much his CV as it was the episodes of American history that he lived through. Hillary Clinton said to me he was the Zelig of American foreign policy. He was always showing up in the middle of action. And the book goes essentially from Vietnam, where he began his career as a young Foreign Service officer in the Mekong Delta, right where the war was at its most intense in 1963, through the 70s and the Carter years, when he was the youngest Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia ever, and participated in the normalization of relations with China, to the high point, the post-Cold War years, in which he was the architect of the end of the war in Bosnia, negotiating the Dayton Peace Treaty, and to its sad and even tragic conclusion under Barack Obama, where Holbrooke was given the thankless task of trying to find a way to end the war in Afghanistan, and also to try to win the trust of a president who didn't particularly care for him, and that was Obama. That's the story. It's a pretty rich piece of history, and it really does coincide with what I think of as the period of American supremacy and then of its ending. And so the two stories of Holbrooke and of the American century naturally flowed together into one story.
Hmm. You know, I was really struck in reading the book, especially as you catalog his early days in Vietnam, how many anachronisms seemed to permeate those pages. The notion of a young Foreign Service officer being able to have, maybe not to have latitude is the right way to put it, but to exploit the kind of the watchful, hairy eyeball of Washington, or to evade it rather. It's hard to imagine the department of today allowing for that kind of, we'll call it entrepreneurship, maybe. What do you think, to what do you attribute some of that to him personally, but also has the department changed to such an extent where we couldn't have a Richard Holbrooke again or today? And are we worse for it or not?
Well, just to let our participants know what he did, he was 22 years old and was the senior American civilian in an entire province of South Vietnam. Yeah. And one of the key provinces where the Viet Cong were becoming dominant in the countryside in 63. He was leading civilian counterinsurgency handing out building materials and bulgur wheat, working with the local self-defense militia, and filing reports to Saigon, and discovering how much of what was going on was self-defeating on the American part. He saw that very early and reported it very clearly. He was not afraid to tell his superiors what they didn't want to hear. In fact, he almost relished it, even though he sucked up and was a networker and used the tennis court to become friends with powerful people like Maxwell Taylor and William Westmoreland. He still was a very clear-eyed and blunt young diplomat who had the authority of experience. He was in the Delta. They were in Saigon, so they had to listen to him. How likely is it that such a aggressive networker would be tolerated? He wasn't very tolerated. I mean, he had to leave the Foreign Service by 1972 or 3 because he had made enough enemies that he just wasn't being promoted fast enough, and his ambitions were outrunning the rate of promotion in the Foreign Service. So it was too small for him. He came back in as a political appointee. But it's also, I think, an institutional change. You know, there was no email, so no one knew what he was doing. And he was kind of on his own, making big decisions at a very young age and kind of living and dying by the results of them. And I think it is something of a loss that today, the very best Foreign Service officers are hemmed in by their knowledge that everything they do is going to be immediately recorded and vetted back in Washington by people whose agendas may not be as good as theirs, and whose knowledge is certainly less than theirs. So I think something of a sclerosis has set in that bureaucracy, as in all of our bureaucracies, that has not benefited the country or the people who serve it.
Yeah, and you know, I remember fondly in my first week in the department going to the pneumatic tube to send off a telegram cable at the time. And, you know, it seems like another lifetime ago because so quickly thereafter we moved on to email and other things.
Yeah.
So in many ways, it really, we're reminded of what a different time it was in which he came of age in the department. But I think, you know, there's something else that, and a number of reviewers have pointed to this in their appraisal of the book, which is Holbrook's relationship with women, and the degree to which, as we think about whether there could be a Holbrook today, you know, is there not the question also of, could a woman have gotten away with half of what he did? In preparing for our conversation, I reached out to some folks in the department. Somebody told me they were interviewed by him at a urinal for a job, and that you know, a number of people were screamed at and so on. And a number of folks said, should we continue to buy into but he was a genius argument? As we think about efforts to rebuild and reshape the department, mustn't we demand more than brilliance, but also the way that people are treated? Is that a big part of the broader kind of American decay, that we have placed people in the annals of history at such high levels who have roundly mistreated people throughout the course of their careers?
Well, there's a lot in the book not to like. There's a lot of stories of Holbrook's cruelty and his self-centeredness, pushing him to do things and to treat people, women and men. Women, I think, did get it particularly bad from him because he had the kind of thoughtless sexism of his generation and of most generations. And he didn't consider them to be his real competition. So in some ways, his closest relationships were with women because he didn't see them as a threat the way his Some of his best friends became threats, like Anthony Lake, for example,
Right.
who was his best friend in Vietnam. But at the same time, that meant that he didn't consider them to be, at his level. At the same time, though, there is a whole cohort of younger State Department people and government people who worked for Holbrooke, both at the UN in 2000, 1999, 2000, and then at the Afghanistan office in 2009 and 10, who saw his flaws clearly, but still admired and even revered him, because he did have this knack for inspiring loyalty among people working under him. And that included a lot of women. And he also had a knack for tweaking the bureaucracy by putting his people into jobs that they might not have been able to get by the normal promotion. Now that could rattle, some of the China and piss off some of the bureaucracy. But at the same time, I've interviewed many young people who worked for him who said they never would have gotten as far as they did if Holbrooke hadn't insisted that they come with him to a meeting with Hillary Clinton in the secretary's office. So his roughness and wildness could be very hard to take, but I don't think they should be disqualifying, because if so, then we lose something that isn't genius. It's an emphasis on action and on actually solving problems and making a difference, which is really what drove Holbrooke and what should drive everyone who works in government. But as we all know, so many people, it either gets sort of beaten out of them, or they lose that will, or they couldn't encounter too many obstacles and begin to settle for simply filing the memo. And Holbrooke never did. And I don't want to lose that while calling out his character for the harm that it did to people.
Yeah, and I think maybe that's a good place for us to transition to what it means in this moment, and turning to your recent piece in the Atlantic in April, the print edition, How to Destroy a Government. And if I can read a couple of sentences from that, because I think this is where it kind of gets interesting. You say, bureaucrats never received such public praise as they did during the weeks of the impeachment inquiry. But the hearings left a misleading impression. The Ukraine story, like the Russia story before it, did not represent a morality tale in which truth and honor stood up to calumny and corruption and prevailed. Yovanovitch is gone, and so is her replacement, Bill Taylor, and so are Mike McKinley and others. Lieutenant Colonel Vindman was marched out of the White House in early February, while Pompeo is still there, and above him, the president. Trump is winning. And so as we think about this own moment in which we find ourselves, what do you say of what do you make of the shape of dissent of Steve Linick, the Inspector General's dismissal and firing, but of also the relative assent of so many employees in this moment? We could rattle off names of those who left defiantly, but so many more who have bent themselves to accommodate this moment. What do you make of that, and what would Holbrooke say about this time?
I mean, it's a very hard balance to figure out when you should leave, how you should leave, whether you should leave at all. This is something that Holbrooke and his generation faced during Vietnam. Very few of them quit. And there's a good essay that was in the Atlantic in 1968 by a former NSC official, Asia expert named James Thompson. And it's all about the forces that keep people inside an organization from being able to either change it or to get out of it. They tell themselves that they'll hold their fire on this issue in order to be effective on the next one. They tell themselves that if they quit, it will only serve their own vanity. It won't help anyone. That they'll be replaced by someone worse. That So it's a very hard situation to find yourself in. If I were in the State Department right now, I would be in agony every day trying to figure out what I could still do, whether I could serve in good conscience, how hard I could push without ending up blowing myself up or blowing others up.
Right.
I think in the story I wrote, the figure who maybe embodies that best is George Kent, the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Europe, who really fought hard on the inside to keep Marie Yovanovitch in her post and to fight back against the lies and smears that were coming from Rudy Giuliani and his cronies and eventually from the White House. But once Kent met the implacable resistance of Secretary Pompeo, who was not going to do anything that would estrange him from the White House, he kind of had to lower his profile.
Right.
And probably told himself, and I wouldn't blame him, that he was still able to get some things done on corruption in Ukraine and other issues, and that if he were to leave, that it wouldn't happen. So I think it's a really hard challenge. The Trump presidency has put the civil service and the foreign service in the worst position it's ever been in, as far as I know, in terms of being undermined and corrupted and cowed into submission. The choice now seems to be either you keep your head down and hope no one notices you, or you pledge public loyalty to the president, not to the Constitution, but to the president, or you leave. And I'm afraid that if Trump is reelected, there's going to be a massive exodus because a lot of people are just holding on to get through this term. What would Holbrooke think? I mean, there would be no Holbrooke in a Trump administration because, first of all, their foreign policy views are diametrically opposed. Holbrooke believed in everything Trump despises, internationalism, cooperation, an activist and leadership role for the United States, the importance of multilateral organizations and of alliances. And Trump believes in everything Holbrooke despised. So, but the other reason is Holbrooke caused a lot of trouble, and some presidents can tolerate that better than others. Bill Clinton actually was able to tolerate Holbrooke better than most. Trump, Holbrooke wouldn't last under a Trump for a day because the obvious fact that he wasn't personally loyal, that he was in some ways pursuing his own agenda, would be intolerable to Trump. So it's unthinkable that there could be a Holbrooke. Holbrooke would have a lot to say about the Trump administration, but it would all be from the outside.
No, I think that's really interesting. You know, and as we've talked some about Vietnam, and as we think about that moment as an asymmetrical dynamic, certainly on the battlefields there, which were so different than what the U.S. had confronted previously, it strikes me that we are confronting our own moment of asymmetrical threat. In your article on how to destroy government, you note that Trump has punished perceived enemies by co-opting craven allies, driving out career officials of competence and integrity. The result is a thin layer of political loyalists on top of a cowed democracy. So
bureaucracy, right?
Bureaucracy,
right.
Rather. We're bringing a butter fight to a gun battle here? I mean, how, as we think to the future, how do we build institutions that are resilient when we have seen what I think so many of us regarded as, I don't know, laws or regulatory requirement, but certainly norms that were cast far more in stone than they were in whatever ether that has just been so completely, vitiated. Like, how do you think about what that means for the future?
I mean, Trump has pushed it all to the limit. There's been no president that I'm aware of who has so trampled on the norm that the federal bureaucracy serves the American people and the Constitution. It carries out the policies of the elected president, but its highest obligation is to the public and to the Constitution. And instead, this demand for personal loyalty and this willingness to crush any flicker of independence, such as getting rid of all the inspectors general, including at the State Department. That's something that no president, Nixon came close during Watergate, but no one has been as unashamed and brutal about it as Trump. So nothing can happen while he's president. There can be no insurgency. There can be no kind of quiet, dignified pushing for the right thing, because it won't survive. He will find it out and he'll crush it. But if Trump leaves, that's not going to be the answer, because what Trump did was found a weakened bureaucracy and weakened it much further. It's not as though it was healthy when he arrived.
That's right.
There are lots of ways in which the Foreign Service had been beaten down and weakened in the decades before Trump got there. One example is the percentage of political appointees in key positions has been rising for 30 years or more, since the 70s at least. And the percentage of ambassadors in key positions, key posts, who are not Foreign Service officers, but are essentially friends and donors who are being paid back for their support, has also been increasing dramatically. Trump has made it all worse, as he's made everything worse, but that was happening a long time before Trump. And I think for the State Department to become what it could be and perhaps has been, it needs to take a hard look at its own practices and at the ways in which certain trends have been allowed to continue without resistance or without enough resistance. And I think that has to come from the next generation of young people who enter the Foreign Service.
We have a question from an audience member, William McElhaney, that is, I think, along these same lines. He says, Trump's consolidation of power seems like a sort of political version of the coronavirus. But even before this, for a while, it has seemed like our society's dysfunctions had reached the point where we needed so much rethink and reset. For me, it was just a question of when we'd reach a critical mass of pain that could force the issue. Do you think we're there now with this administration's attacks on our norms and institutions and the related destruction COVID is causing? Any hope that these have in them the seeds of a great new era of reform and social advancement that could take shape under good leadership? I mean, have we hit bottom? Are we there?
God, I hope so.
Yeah.
First of all, that's beautifully put. That should be published somewhere, because it's such a clear and passionate statement of what so many people seem to be thinking and feeling at the same time. I wrote this short essay for The Atlantic, "We are living in a failed state." I didn't mean we are in a textbook failed state. The police are still working,
Sure.
The mail arrives, checks come from the federal government. It's not Iraq in 2004. It's not Somalia. But we have no national leadership that we can look to for plans, strategies, help, empathy, anything. There's a complete void right now at the most critical moment that I can remember in our nation's history for leadership and for competence. So I think we are at that point. It's been a long time coming. My book, The Unwinding, which Matt mentioned, is really the history of the decline of our institutions of democracy, not just government, but corporate, media, civic, through the lives of half a dozen Americans who you follow in the book. That was in 2013. That was some years ago. And it already felt as if the patient was suffering from some pretty serious underlying conditions. I think what COVID has done is just exposed the state of, it's like a stress test, the state of the body politic as being high risk and shockingly weak. and unable to respond to something on this scale. I don't see how we can go on from here in the same way. We cannot drift along. We cannot either. There's a great line by Lincoln from a very early speech. He was a young legislator, and he said, we won't be, I'm paraphrasing, we're not going to be conquered by some Napoleon from across the sea. We shall either live forever as a republic of free people or die by suicide. Mm. And I think that is key to understanding this country and what makes it tick. We won't disappear from the face of the earth, but if our ability to govern ourselves continues to deteriorate to the point where we're at now, we will no longer be that country that Lincoln was talking about. That will be a kind of suicide. We'll become something else. And I think this moment is, as far as I can see, and I do not prognosticate because I don't think that's the business of journalists, it is the moment of truth, the moment of reckoning.
Well, I think suicide, unfortunately, is so apt because so much of it is really self-inflicted, right? If we think about all the various threats we face, so many of them are coming from within. I want to remind our listeners, our viewers, our audience members to please submit your questions using the Q&A function at the bottom. As we move into the Q&A portion of our conversation, I want to invite Wes Reiser, a Truman member, to offer a reflection for a moment. Wes, you're so thoughtful on these matters, and to help us bridge into this next phase of this conversation, I'd love to turn to you for a few of your own thoughts and reflections.
Thanks so much, Jenna, and thank you, George. I endorse wholeheartedly everything that you have said, both about the past of American greatness in diplomacy, as well as some of the unique challenges that we face right now. Like Jenna, I started at the State Department kind of right at the end when you still used paper telegrams, and there was a single internet terminal at the end of the office suite that everybody could share and use for maybe 15 minutes a day. And in that regard, obviously, the American diplomatic machinery has moved on and advanced at least a little bit. You know, when the State Department was ordered to go home in March, the whole department had a telework capacity of about 1,500. And had over 100,000 people trying to log in the very next Monday to do essential business on behalf of the American people all around the world. And you can imagine how badly that went, and the challenges that we continue to face there. But I want to highlight just a couple comments that you made about these challenges, and then ask you sort of where you think we can head to reset the system in a way that can actually serve the American people as well as the global community, right? Because despite the fact that we are clearly no longer the world's sole superpower, the United States is still, depending how you measure it, the first or second largest economy on the planet. We have the most powerful military on the planet, and yet do not appear to be up to the task anymore of the leadership role that one would expect to go along with that. A couple examples of problematic areas that I think we have to think about on the day after Trump is one, how do we dramatically rethink the structure of our foreign policy apparatus? One that right now is still very much aimed at the Cold War, with the Europe Bureau still being the largest and most powerful regional bureau in the State Department right now. Secondly, on the pernicious role of political appointees, you know, I won't even point to anybody from this administration. You know, when President Obama nominated an ambassador to Norway that didn't even know the country had a king, when he went before the Senate for confirmation, and sent a vacuum cleaner salesman who did bodybuilder shoots to Finland. I mean, those are classic examples of how dysfunctional our system is. When here in Washington, I regularly meet with ambassadors who, if not career diplomats, are career academics who have been in the bureaucracy for a while in their home country and they know the tradecraft well. I think that's a tiny piece of what we need to fix, but I see the challenges as far greater. How do we rebuild a dissent channel that works now that all forms of dissent have essentially been quashed inside the government, and there isn't even an inspector general left for staff to go to if they have challenges. And one who had been quite brave, for that matter, in actually addressing political retaliation against low-level career officials in several bureaus in the department. This wasn't only against the senior folks, right? A lot of the reporting is about regular line officers who've been targeted by the administration. But beyond that, how do we make those people more accountable, both from the bottom to the top in the bureaucracy? And how do we reestablish these norms? These are the big questions that I'm trying to wrap my mind around, because there's still, I think, an expectation that if Trump loses the election, that on January 21st, we can just push this reset button and all of our bureaucratic machinery is just going to be able to be back up and running, and it'll be like December of 2016 all over again. And the reality is that we've lost enormous amounts of talent. But we also have still a lot of talented people trying to hang on and do their jobs well to be there for the day after, who will leave, by the way, for sure, if Trump is reelected. But if he's not, those people will be sitting there, but they're going to be sitting inside an architecture that is wholly ill-suited for the United States as one of many players in a multipolar world, that is wholly ill-suited to the technological realities of the world that we live in now, and built based upon a lot of assumptions that were built up in the 1960s and 70s and 80s of the world that we lived in then. And so I would really welcome your thoughts on where to even start. Where do we start thinking about these challenges? And what are the ways in which both those who continue to serve inside can do, but also how those on the outside can work to build a constituency to repair these institutions like the State Department that are so key to American power and prestige.
I mean, Wes, you're saying these things publicly is a place to start. And I admire you for it, and I appreciate it. I think there needs to be more Wes Reiser. Is that how you pronounce it? There need to be more people like you who are applying pressure from within and from below. I mean, I was just imagining as you were talking, okay, what if President Biden named a career Foreign Service officer as Secretary of State, which would be a radical step? How much of a difference would that make? And I at first thought, okay, that would be a good move. And then I began to think, no, that probably is not going to, it's too deep. It's too structural. It's been going on for too long for one person, a la Colin Powell, to get up and, say, I hear you. I'm going to be your Secretary of State. It has to come from within the ranks. It has to come from pressure from people who are, just willing to risk what you're willing to risk. And I don't know how that happens, because I think one of the ills that has set in is an aversion to risk, partly because the people above you have made it so costly. And partly, I'm not sure, it just seems to be maybe the nature of bureaucracies that over time, you figure out where the pain is and you avoid it, because who wants to go through their career, just having fights and getting bruised all the time. But I don't know, I don't have any laid out plan. All I know is that hearing you speak tells me that that's what's going to happen. It will have to be a really outspoken and unafraid group of career officers who are willing to tell the people above them what they don't want to hear again and again. The Yovanovitch story, which again seemed to the public like a story of bravery in the Foreign Service, and it definitely was really a story of how much it took to get Foreign Service officers to do anything. No one went to the dissent channel. No one went to the Inspector General. No one went to the press. It only came out because of a transcript of a phone call that someone in the White House, went to a different Inspector General. So in a way, it's a sign of how how sclerotic or deteriorated the will of the Foreign Service to not just to speak up for itself, but for the country has become. So what I would love is to read some essays or papers or talk even one-to-one with people like you, Wes, so that my ideas and your ideas can start to ferment, because I think there will have to be a real burst of energy, but also of kind of impatience and of willingness to do what isn't normally done. Because otherwise, you're so right that January 21st is going to be a massive kind of return to a state of stasis that is intolerable now. So I hope we stay in touch, Wes. And I also would love to hear from other people who are in on this conversation, who are probably thinking about these things way out ahead of me, because I'm really interested in your ideas.
Well, thanks for that, George. And I agree with you. I think we'd all be in a better place if there were more Wes risers. So thanks, Wes, for offering those really thoughtful reflections. And we at Truman are working on that, and certainly invite continued dialogue on that. I want to turn to some of the other questions we've received. First, Jonathan Morgenstein offers that he does not have a question, but he wants to thank you for your works. As a reserve Marine officer who served twice in Iraq and who opposed it from the beginning, I found Assassin's Gate to be extraordinary and the best book on the war I've read. And as one who served in Bosnia with the Marines and in Kosovo with NGOs, I was deeply impacted by the fall of Yugoslavia and its accompanying genocides. I've always held Holbrook as one of my personal heroes. I know he was a flawed one, but a major hero of mine nonetheless. Thank you for your book and all of your writings. It means a lot.
Well, I'm the one who's supposed to thank you, but I really appreciate the thought.
And Jonathan is a member and an outstanding person. So thank you for that comment, Jonathan, and for your service. Rob Beglin asks, isn't Holbrook's life the ultimate arc of a Paul Mill officer? He apprentices at the beginning of Vietnam with a Lansdale protege, and he concludes his professional success with Balkan Wars. Doesn't his life demonstrate the potential and limits of American effort abroad overwhelmingly weighted towards the exercise of military power?
That's a great question. And the answer is complicated, because although Holbrook did get recruited by Rufus Phillips, who was a former CIA officer who took Lansdale's place in South Vietnam and who was a real evangelist for sort of democracy promotion in the guise of counterinsurgency, Holbrook also spent a lot of time around American military advisors. At that point, it was still the advisory mission. And he became a real skeptic of firepower and of strategy that wasn't really strategy, body counts, attrition, and wrote in both private letters to his fiancée, which were part of that trove that I received when I got his archive, but also in his more public writings. He thought that the militarization of the Vietnam policy was a bad thing, not just for the fighting of the war, because we couldn't win with firepower, but also for the US government, because he had come of age thinking it was the civilians who made policy. And it turned out it was Westmoreland who was setting the policy and Washington who was giving him what he wanted. So, and at the end of his life in Afghanistan, he had the exact same experience. He was confronting David Petraeus every day in the Situation Room and losing, because Petraeus, in a sense, kind of had President Obama cornered when he was asking, when the military was asking for more troops. And because Holbrook had no standing with Obama, he never was able or willing to make the case he wanted to make, which is, this is Vietnam again. We cannot win by sending more troops. We need to be talking to the Taliban, talking to the enemy. That was a case he had a lot of trouble even articulating because he had been marginalized in the Obama years. In between those two wars came Bosnia, where maybe in the best example, American policymakers used force and diplomacy in an alignment that really was thought through and successful, because it was the kind of war where it didn't take much force to push the warring parties to where negotiators could actually get some results. And so for every success, there's a failure. And then for every failure, there's a success. And so Holbrook's career shows maybe that America simply couldn't stay out of these messy wars in which politics was at the heart of the matter. And we tried military solutions to political problems and succeeded once and failed on a very large scale at least twice.
I mean, you talk here about an era, I think, especially with respect to Bosnia, in which civilian military relations were in a different place. And then as we see that arc to Afghanistan and the presence that Petraeus had, and how just dramatically the Department of Defense has outpaced diplomats in the field. I myself spent a year as a military advisor in the Western Hemisphere, and I think I counted, I was like 43-1 on my counterparts.
Well, Jenna, I want to ask you, is this largely about budgets and personnel, or is this about the power that presidents give to their military and take from their diplomats?
Well, I think it's kind of both, right? If Wes makes the point, what do we get with, $800 billion of a defense budget that won't save Americans from 100,000 lives lost at home and counting? What are the wars that we're fighting for? What's the money for? And what are the capabilities that we need? And, what are we trying to solve for? This notion of, we have a Department of Defense that is set up ostensibly to defend against two simultaneous wars, the structures of which we haven't seen in years, seems pretty remarkable at a moment like this in particular.
Yeah.
But that is many years in the making, clearly. I see we have on our call Frank Kendall, and if maybe Frank has a question or a thought to offer on this in the chat. Frank is a board member and was the former Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics, and so bought everything that the Defense Department buys. I would love your thoughts on this. It seems that any plans, any policies to reform the Department of State as an institution have also to do with how it relates to the Department of Defense. And one of the things that we try to do here at Truman is to build a constituency, not just for defense as an instrument of power, but for diplomacy and for development. You were such a good you've resisted the urge to prognosticate, but I think you have diagnosed very well the disease here. Do you sense an increased appetite for reevaluating this age-old question of how we elevate diplomacy, which has for so long come at the expense of ever increasing defense budgets?
I think among insiders, definitely. Among people who are professionals in national security, foreign policy, there's an overwhelming sense that the old ways of doing it, the old structures, the old budgets, and the old slogans just are worn out and should have to be replaced by new thinking. As for the broader public, the real challenge is to get them interested in foreign policy again, because, I mean, if you remember during the Democratic primary debates, it hardly came up unless some journalists thought to ask one question at the end of the debate. So, and yet here we are with the pandemic, reminded that we are, no country can be an island, and that we have this incredibly fraught relationship right now with China, which I know that Pete Buttigieg thought and talked about rather a lot. He's, I guess, a member or a former member of the project.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But which, again, was just an afterthought for most of the candidates. And that's because they know the American people don't really want to hear about it. We're profoundly inwardly focused right now. And my fear is that unless there's a serious effort at re-establishing almost sort of the credibility of the insiders to be able to talk about this stuff, which is a complicated matter, people aren't going to listen, and will be left to the demagoguery of Donald Trump or to the kind of empty idealism and utopianism that came more from the Bernie Sanders side of the Democratic Party, where the United States was seen more like an international NGO than a world power. So
yeah,
it's a very vague and unformed time, but that actually is a good moment for people like your members, people listening in, to try to define it, because I think it's up for grabs.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. And, as we often say here at Truman, that it's all voters are foreign policy voters. It's just the extent to which they realize it.
Yeah,
certainly
absolutely.
It impacts people everywhere. Zach Tyson says, there are a lot of us within the Truman family who are out speaking, writing, or just talking with colleagues and adjacent to government about the necessity of change. But the reform has always been driven from below, hasn't it? And how do we get the American people, it's just to your recent point, to care about having an effective and modern government? All of us here read The Atlantic, but my mom and her friends in Kentucky don't. Maybe this reaches back to this question of, do we have a national moment? Is there enough here of collective suffering or experienced at scale to move the needle? And this is something we grapple with at Truman all the time. How do you talk to these folks?
Well, I think the pandemic has given us 2 or 3 truths that need to be made clear or need to be repeated, because they're easily lost in the noise and the onslaught of half-truths, lies, and distractions of Twitter and of the media. One, of course, which is not what we're talking about today, is the perilous weakness of our internal politics, the divisions, the polarization, the partisanship, and also the weakness of our social safety net and of our worker protections and of all the things that we've seen with horror happening around us that make us look more like a third world country. But another is the inevitable interconnectedness of the world. I mean, there are two very different paths that you can take when something like this happens. One is build a better wall, stop flights from coming in, withdraw from global organizations that have failed, and compete with our friends to score the vaccine, and in general treat this as an excuse to indulge in national selfishness and aggressive posturing. And the other is to see that we cannot begin to solve this problem without cooperating with other countries and without having strong alliances, strong international organizations, and where they're weak, make them stronger. And I think the campaign will partly be about that. And although Joe Biden is not the most vigorous and forward-looking candidate that you can imagine, he does have a lifetime of reflexes which are internationalist, and which I think will allow him to try to make that case. But he's not going to do it. It's going to have to come from people who are well below him and who are in other, who are not on a Democratic campaign, but who were doing it in other venues. But I think that the public, the virus has forced the public to think about how we are connected to the rest of the world. Some of them may want to say, let's break those connections. Others may want to say, let's strengthen those connections because we depend on them. But the issue is now joined. It's in front of us. And that's a moment when foreign policy can actually get the attention of the public.
Well, I think that's a wonderful place to close our conversation on the how this moment of crisis does create opportunity. And that in the absence of leadership, there is, I think, within this community, especially great capacity to define it and to redefine it and to rebuild it. I want to remind our Truman members on the line that we will come together for events throughout the next several months. We have a true community event to watch Space Force together this weekend to give everybody a break from the news, and a number of other important conversations forthcoming on development. We didn't get as much to USAID today. I know others have questions there. We'll be continuing to explore these topics even as we build towards the election and advise and craft policies in support of broader democratic opening and rebuilding this country, which so desperately needs it and which we all think hold very dear. George, I want to thank you so much for your time here with us today, and for your pen, and for your contributions to the discourse at this really critical time. And we look forward to continuing the conversation.
Well, Jenna, thanks for having me. I hope people who have thoughts on this subject that they want to share will get in touch with me. You can do it either through Jenna and the Truman Project, or my email is ghpacker3@gmail.com. So I really would love to hear from you, because I don't think I've got the ideas. I'm sure that they're more with you, and I'd like to hear them. Thanks very much.
Terrific. And we will ask everybody to look at the chat one last time. The link is there. We encourage you to buy the book. It's a lot to think about, and I think raises a lot of really important questions. George, thank you so much.
Take care, everyone. Be well.
Take care. Be well.